Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you.
Will respond.
Turn it around. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I begin by taking this opportunity to express my sympathies and solidarity with all the victims across Jamaica of Hurricane Melissa, the many who died, the numbers still not finalized, and those who are still suffering from the aftermath of this terrible storm. Madam Speaker, it is a sad situation in the configuration of the affairs of this world that we, living in a small island developing state like Jamaica, are the recipients of the increasingly vicious effects of the climate crisis, a crisis which we did very little, if anything, to cause. The global warming as a result of the excessive use of carbon and emissions from carbon fuels over the last few centuries since the Industrial Revolution, that global warming has largely been driven by the wealthy economies of the world. And yet we, in Jamaica and other islands like ourselves, are suffering the consequences of that on an annual basis. We were hit by Beryl, or scraped by Beryl. Last year, it was a serious hit. And this year, we got walloped by Melissa. It's really a shame that the international financial community is still approaching the mitigation of the effects of climate-induced disasters on countries like ours by financing packages that are largely based on additional debt. These debts that we are now going to be incurring to finance our attempts at recovery are like lending money to a business that suffered losses through some kind of crisis that is trying to dig itself out of a hole from. Taking on additional debt to do that is going to be a challenging road for any country. Therefore, I don't think it's appropriate to treat these announcements in a triumphant way. We are going to be incurring the costs of paying back this massive additional borrowing in years to come. We are in a country which has spent the last 15 years seeking to get ourselves out of a debt trap, where we've had to run massive primary surpluses every year consistently to reduce our debt to GDP ratio, with a target that's written into our law incidentally by a government from this side, which we were anticipating would have been met this year before Melissa struck us. And now we are facing a new era of massive incremental borrowing. If you look at $3.6 billion US of sovereign debt, that's over 25% of GDP of additional borrowing. That does, and the $662 billion already available, only less than half of that is in a form that's not debt. Most of that is debt as well. This $2.4 billion of private capital, we look forward to seeing whether that will be forthcoming and in what volumes, because you can't project that you're going to receive private investment as part of your recovery. I'm glad that the multilaterals are going to support the effort, but at the end of the day, investors have to be willing and there have to be projects available to them that are bankable and investable. So we will see whether or not that happens. But the reality is that only 12 million US out of how much? $7 billion is grant funding. Only 12 million US out of over 6 billion of programmed US funding is grant funding. That is the world that we as Jamaicans, both you on that side and us on this side, have to navigate.
House Leader, members' time for speaking has expired. House Leader, the members' time for speaking has expired.
We didn't visit your Prime Minister's speech with the kind of response that you're giving mine.
Madam Speaker, as the time for the opposition leader has expired, to speak has expired, we ask that you give him sufficient time to complete his presentation.
House, the question is that the Leader of Opposition be allowed an additional 5 minutes to complete his presentation. No. Members, I am going to ask that no one asks for sufficient time to complete, because those words can mean a 2-hour, 3-hour presentation like the member from St. Andrew South. Yes, Angela, you know it's you, who spoke for hours. What is your point of order? What's your point of order? You're correct.
That violates the standing order.
Member, you're correct. But it is not in keeping with the approach of Parliament to speak until conclusion, whenever that is. And we have learned our lesson, as the member so nicely stood up and reminded us. So she knows who we are speaking of. So 5 minutes, House. Those in favor? Those against, the ayes have it. House Leader?
Yeah, I suppose I should be grateful, though it's a very parsimonious allocation of time to respond to such an important speech on such an important occasion. It's symptomatic of what is wrong with this Parliament, that the Leader of the Opposition is given 5 minutes more to finish a presentation. Anyway, that is the world in which we are being required to live. Madam Speaker, the institution which has been announced to oversee the recovery process, which does not yet exist, it is just an announcement thus far. This National, I think, Resilience and Recovery, or Recovery and Resilience Authority, NARA, is going to, we are told, be responsible for the relief resources being spent in a judicious way, in a way that's efficient, in a way that is accountable and transparent, and in a way that accords with a sensible policy of recovery. After all, the PIOJ has indicated that this financial quarter that we're in now, the economy is going to contract by some 11, I think, to 13% of GDP relative to the same quarter last year. That is a massive contraction. And it's going to further exacerbate the debt-to-GDP ratio because, of course, the debt-to-GDP ratio has two components. There's debt and there's GDP. So what we're seeing here is that debt is going to be growing dramatically, and GDP is in the process of a free fall as a result of this terrible calamity that has hit us. So while I admire and indeed share optimism about the future, because Jamaica is such a resilient and special country, and we will get through this, I think we should approach an announcement like this with some sobriety. this event has caused us to retrace our steps substantially from the economic path we were on, and which the nation incurred substantial sacrifices to get to where we were. I'm not blaming the government for Melissa. That would be absurd. I'm not blaming the government for seeking resources to fund the recovery. It's going to be necessary to get those resources. I am just making the point that this is not something to celebrate. This is not something to gloat about. This represents a substantial setback for Jamaica, and it represents if it's not administered properly, it could permanently weaken our future prospects and damage the country's future. Which is all the more reason why the composition of this recovery authority is important. I wrote to the Prime Minister on the day after the hurricane to suggest the establishment of a task force with broad-based representation, leaders from the private sector and business community, leaders from the churches, leaders from the NGOs, and representatives from the government and the opposition. The concept of NARA is consistent with that. However, I've heard nothing from the Prime Minister as to the role of the opposition in NARA. We heard it will be broad-based, but there is no inclusivity in the dialogue around how it is to be constituted. And I can hear from the barbs that are flowing from the other side that the likelihood is that we will not be included in it. That is what I'm hearing from the other side in their responses to me, their sotto voce remarks. All I can say is, Prime Minister, the opposition represents some 400,000 voters who voted for us, 28 constituencies, and our presence in the recovery and our participation in the recovery, you'll be well advised to seek in a genuine...
House Leader, the member's time for speaking has expired. Members.
Thank you. As the member's time for speaking has expired, I ask that you put to the House that he be allowed an additional 2 minutes to complete his presentation.
Complete your presentation, Opposition Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Another generous allocation of time. Thank you very much.
And Opposition Leader,
yes.
Prime Minister got 10 minutes extra on 12 minutes for statement by Minister.
Right.
And,
I won't be nearly as long.
And you got half of that time.
I'm wrapping up.
Yeah.
It's not in my nature to be long-winded. So, Prime Minister, the point I was making is I think you would be well advised to seek, in an authentic way, the inclusion of the opposition in the governance arrangements over which these funds will be administered on this recovery, because Jamaica is facing an unprecedented disaster, the scale of which is indeed awesome and frightening to those who have to encounter it on a daily basis in several parishes across the land. So, Prime Minister, I wait to hear your thoughts on this. I have asked you about it for a month now. You haven't indicated to me your views, but I'm putting to you today again what I consider to be the optimal approach to dealing with this particular matter. Time is short, and I've been asked to finish within 2 minutes, so I will wrap up now. More or none. We will be hearing about the fiscal rules, and we will be hearing about the suspension of the fiscal rules, no doubt. And I'm looking forward to the discussion around that, where I'll have an opportunity to say some more on these matters. Thank you, Madam Speaker.